Hi, welcome to my podcast entitled The Wright Experience. I'm Dr. William T. Wright Jr., the host and founder of this show. I'm now serving in my 9th year as a school superintendent and 24th as a public school educator. Over those years, I've been fortunate enough to get to know and work with some amazing leaders from all across the United States. The goal of this podcast is to share some amazing leaders with you so that we can grow and learn from these leaders and get better every day. Thank you for continuing to support this show. Please know that I see, hear, and appreciate every one of the comments and kind words that are sent my way concerning this podcast. It has far exceeded my expectations thus far, and I'm proud to say that I feel like that we are making a difference in the lives of leaders and want to continue to do so. In my travels, I have learned that we have a growing audience, and for that, I'm grateful. Tonight is episode 27 of The Wright Experience. My guest tonight is an education professional, a veteran education professional. He served for several years as superintendent in a mid-sized district in North Carolina. Then upon his retirement, we had a need for an executive director in the Northeast region of North Carolina. Because of the amazing working relationship that we had established with our guest, I, amongst others, was one of the first ones to speak up and speak of him as the perfect person to serve in this role. He's doing a tremendous job continuing to support superintendents and all educational leaders in our region. My guest tonight is Dr. Chris Mansfield. Dr. Mansfield is a former school administrator and superintendent in Northeastern North Carolina, as I mentioned. He retired in July of 2020 as superintendent of Martin County Schools in North Carolina, and he currently serves as the executive director of the Northeast Regional Education Service Alliance. And when they're not camping, Dr. Mansfield and his wife, Samantha, live in Washington, North Carolina now with their 2 dogs. And at this time, I'd like to present my good friend, Dr. Chris Mansfield.
Good evening, Dr. Wright.
How you doing?
I'm doing? I'm well. Thank you for having me on the show.
All right. You look a little younger since you retired.
Hey, I tell you, retirement is good. I will be the first to admit it.
Very good. I can't say that I'm going to retire in 5 years. Somebody got on my case about that, but I will be eligible for retirement in 5 years. How about that?
Well, you don't know exactly what comes your way until it comes, and sometimes a door opens and you need to walk through it.
That's right.
And that's where I was last summer, and went ahead and retired. And as it so happened, the need became apparent in the Northeast. And so I've been very honored to be able to serve in that executive director role for the Northeast RESA. But yeah, it's been good. I've enjoyed continuing my work with you and all the other superintendents and curriculum leaders in the Northeast. So I'm very happy about that.
Absolutely. We couldn't think of a better person to do that. So, Dr. Mansfield, to kind of kick the questions off for tonight, please describe for us, for our audience in particular, the responsibilities that you now carry as the executive director of the Northeast RESA.
Well, the Northeast Regional Education Service Alliance, and there is a RESA for every region of North Carolina. So there's about 8 of us. Basically, the Northeast RESA is a consortium of school districts in regions of the state. And of course, ours is 17 districts in the Northeast. We stretch from Hertford County all the way to the coast, Dare, and then from Gates County and Northampton County in the north, all the way down to Beaufort, Pitt, Tyrrell, and along those counties. So we basically we kind of surround the Albemarle Sound area. But there's 17 school districts. Most are county districts. We do have one city district in our region. But I work with the superintendents to plan events. Our signature event is the Northeast RISA Leadership Conference that we hold every year in Kitty Hawk. It does two things. It puts us in contact with some amazing keynote speakers. In the past, we've had folks like George Koros, we've had Bill Daggett, Tammy Pulowski. We've had a number of different speakers throughout the years that come to Kitty Hawk and speak to the attendees of the conference, not just superintendents, curriculum leaders, principals, assistant principals. And last year, for the first time, really, we've been able to have teachers attend as well. This year, we're excited because Scholastic has made it possible for us to hear from Dr. Daniel Dickey, who is a tremendous mind in the curriculum area. And so we're excited about him being able to join us. I think also Dr. Catherine Edmonds, who was a former superintendent in our region, Elizabeth City Pasquotank, and now is at the Department of Public Instruction. She'll be joining us. And the other exciting thing about the Kitty Hawk Conference, Dr. Wright, is that it allows us to showcase best practices we find in our own region. Even though we're in the same region of the state, geographically, because of all the water in our area, we're not always able to meet each other as frequently as we'd like. And so there's good work going on all across our region. And the conference, we have around 16 to 20 breakout sessions. Most of these are presented by our own teachers and curriculum leaders throughout the Northeast. We do have some that are presented by Department of Public Instruction folks, but it allows us the opportunity and allows our own people throughout the Northeast to share with one another the best practices and programs and strategies they're using in their district to make a difference with their students. And so that's kind of our signature event for the year. We typically do in the spring. We have done before COVID, we were doing legislative get-togethers with our legislators, trying to just explain to them what our needs are in the Northeast and how we have some different needs than other regions of the state. We help provide, I work with our curriculum leaders to provide professional development programs to our teachers. Last year, we were able to work with the North Carolina Center for Advancement of Teaching, NCAT, to provide several virtual professional development programs because of COVID. So there's a whole myriad of things that we're able to do through the Northeast RISA and it really provides an economy of scale for the Northeast. For several years ago, we were able to contract with a company to do a salary study that would have been probably cost prohibitive for any particular district to do, but as a group, we were able to provide a salary study for classified personnel, which we hope would provide some information to allow districts to take steps to increase salaries for some of their classified folks, from maintenance all the way to teacher assistants and everybody in between. So that's the beauty of having a consortium like that, where we all pull the same direction. We meet regularly. The superintendents meet regularly. Each of the superintendents of their districts they comprise the board of directors for the RISA. So I work hand in hand with them and to decide what we're going to be doing during the year. And it's been a great honor and a privilege. We've had tremendous executive directors in the past, and I'm honored and that I've been chosen to carry that banner forward. So I appreciate that.
Well, you're just as good a one as we've had, Chris, and I'm not just saying that because we're on this podcast. You're doing a tremendous job, and we appreciate your leadership. So, Dr. Mansfield, in the last couple of years since your retirement, well, almost two, the superintendency and educational leadership seems to have changed somewhat. What do you see as the difference?
Well, obviously, the elephant in the room is COVID.
Sure.
And the response to the steps that superintendents have had to take in their districts to respond to COVID has been unprecedented. The number of resources that it has taken to manage this type of pandemic. And in a lot of our, in the Northeast, many of our districts are very small. And in the Northeast, most of our districts are probably if not the largest employer in the district, in the county. So for a pandemic to come along and put a large workforce in jeopardy in that kind of economy can be detrimental. So I think the superintendents have really working hand in hand with the state and with the Department of Public Instruction and their local health departments and the state health department have really had to be creative in how they keep their staff members safe, how you keep your students safe. As we meet, and we met all last year, as you know, via Zoom,
Sure.
virtually, just so we could maintain that contact. We have a lot of new superintendents throughout the Northeast, and so in addition to all the programs we do, we also provide a support network for one another. And no time, I think, has that been more important than during COVID, when you're trying to navigate such a volatile situation. 1 week you are in school. I think back to last March, we were planning normally the end of school and how the rest of the school year was going to go. And then March 13th came and boom, everything got shut down. And so then you're trying to figure out, okay, how do we do graduation? What happens with athletics? How do we keep our students safe? How do we do virtual learning, which many of us, and we've had many discussions in this regard, throughout the Northeast, we were not, and unfortunately, and that's still the case in a lot of areas, do not have the infrastructure for broadband connectivity. So how do you provide distance learning for students when you really don't have an infrastructure that's put in place yet? How do you minimize learning loss? How do you get students to log in, and how do you ask them to be responsive to their teachers and continue their learning? Then how do you go through the summer and get ready for this school year when everything is still sort of uncertain? So that's certainly been a major obstacle that everyone has had to work through. And again, we've had, the state has been good, working through the governor's office, working through the Department of Public Instruction, but you're still out there in your own counties and your districts trying to manage this with the resources that you have in each individual district. And I think a lot of times that is, some of the decisions that you had to make for the health and safety of your employees and of your students were in some cases, I think, misinterpreted.
Sure.
I can't remember a single time that when I was finishing up my tenure in Martin, or any of the folks in our region, and frankly, any of the folks across the state, made decisions about student health and safety dealing with COVID that were done flippantly. They were all done with an air of sensitivity, with an air of cautiousness, air of caution, trying to figure out what the best thing forward was, because at that time, particularly in late 2020 or in that school year, 2019-2020, we didn't know how bad it was. We were still finding out, and the numbers continued to grow. And at that time, we knew that obviously students were not as susceptible to COVID as adults were, but nonetheless, we didn't know all those answers at that time. And this was long before vaccines. So, masks and hand washing and social distancing. And then, of course, we wound up shutting down. Just that, trying to prepare for something that you had no previous experience in, no forewarning, that was quite something.
Yeah, and then the other piece of that is I don't think any of us thought that 18, 20 months later we'd still be trying to figure out how to
Oh, exactly.
get ourselves
And
out of it. So
that's
yeah,
exactly right. And with
sure,
the Delta variant, things are better. Obviously, we're in a different place than we were then. But today, the president released some uh, mandates as far as OSHA is concerned, and that'll affect all employers with over 100 employees. So that certainly will impact school systems in
sure.
terms of mandated vaccinations or mandated testing. So, but I think everyone needs to understand, parents, students, and you see these fights across the region, across the state, across the country on mandatory masks or mandatory vaccinations. And I just want to be clear, as a former employee now dealing with this from a different perspective. I have not seen one professional educator that I can think of that has taken this um, flippantly, that has not taken this as seriously as possible, because they know the impact this can have to their districts, to their students, and to their students' families. Many of our students in the Northeast, and this is true of not just in Northeast North Carolina, but we have a lot of students in Northeastern North Carolina that have multi-generational family members living in the household. So when a student is exposed, whether or not that student contracts COVID, they still put those other family members potentially in jeopardy. This is a problem that is not, there were no easy boundaries to this problem. You had to really think uh, far and away beyond just the normal policy sorts of issues. And as I said before, given that for many of our districts, the school systems are the largest employer. Trying to keep your bus drivers employed, trying to keep your cafeteria people employed, trying to keep your teachers assistants employed, because if you don't employ them and then you cannot pay them, the economic repercussions for those families and ultimately for those districts can be devastating.
Yeah.
And you may not recover for those for years. Unfortunately, we've seen the devastating effects of having continuous virtual learning in a situation in which we really were not very prepared for that. And we still have students that are trying to catch up from last year who did lose, unfortunately. Many of our students will catch up over time and have caught up this past year, but for a lot of students, that is a very difficult challenge to catch up from learning that they lost because we couldn't come to school every day. They could not come to school every day. So
And that's right. And the key word of that is overtime.
over
Overtime is
time, that's
going
exactly
to
correct.
take time. And want to go back and circle back a little bit on one thing that you talked about, the infrastructure and the challenges with that in rural North and Northeastern North Carolina in particular. Just in our district here, about 58% of our homes, and I say this every chance I get because I want people to understand, about 58% of our homes have little or no internet access.
Correct.
So
I don't doubt that at all. That's what we would find that in Martin County as well, and even in some areas, very poor cellular reception.
sure.
So to try to use a cell phone to connect via a hotspot or something, that was still limited.
Sure.
And then in a lot of cases that is an additional charge if you go over your data limit. So there's a number of there's a number of those infrastructure issues that we deal with in Eastern North Carolina, and this goes back to geography and how we're different than other areas of the state. And not that even populated areas like the I-40 corridor Not that they don't have infrastructure issues as well, but I would say that their percentage of areas that are not connected is far lower than what we see. You know, if you're in the I-40, I-85 corridor, that's um, there's greater connectivity throughout that area, primarily driven because there's greater industry in those areas, and we know that that industry will drive those providers to make those connections available.
Well, to drive your point home, I grew up in Nash County, and I lived in Wake for about 7 years, and I don't remember dropping a call hardly ever
Right.
there. And I drop one every day here
That's right.
where I am now. I mean, I can leave downtown Ahoskie, where I live, and ride 5 miles in either direction, and I'm going to lose internet service. So,
Dr. Wright, we were talking about just how the superintendency is different, and this is
sure.
this is one that I was actually slow to adopt, unfortunately. And if I were to go back and do it over again, and you've done a remarkable job with that with this podcast, and that's social media.
Yeah.
You know, it started just several years ago. It was Facebook and Twitter, but now it's Facebook, Twitter, gosh, TikTok, Instagram, and you name it.
All of it, right.
And they're popping up all the time. There's Telegraph, and there's all these different ones that are available that parents use or students use or community uses, and you have to really be, if you're going into a superintendency and you are not social media savvy, you need to get social media savvy. Find someone. And I'll drop a name here. The person that made me feel so inadequate was Rob Jackson, who's now in
All of us.
Carteret County. But Rob was so good, and I'm sure he still is so good in using social media to tell the story of his district. And I that was an area that if I were to do over, I would spend a lot more time getting better at that. And that's just, I just wasn't as comfortable doing it as other people are. This podcast is an example of a way to break out in that and do that right. A lot of our colleagues throughout the Northeast are doing a phenomenal job with social media. Them personally themselves, and then their districts do a wonderful job as well. But that's certainly a game changer. Messaging, of course, is everything, and
Absolutely.
using social media to tell your story is vitally important. I think, to get the correct story out there. Obviously, you're going to have times when the news is not always great, but telling the story the correct way is always better than having the details left up to folks who don't know, because they will fill in the details one way or the other, and you want the correct details to be out there. So
That's right. And that's a constant battle because
Oh, yeah.
people make assumptions and everything. But you're right. We do have to be the first one to tell our story and make sure that we tell it correctly. Absolutely. Absolutely. Dr. Mansfield, this next question, this is my statement, not yours. So I'll start off by saying that. And then if you agree with it, then I'd love to hear your insight on it. Right now, in the state of North Carolina in particular, there appears to be what I'm calling more centralized control of school districts at the state level instead of through local school boards. How can we fix that shift and get it back more to local control?
Well, I think certainly in some aspects, I agree with you. Going back to when North Carolina adopted the ABCs program,
right,
way back in the day, if a lot of people don't remember, the C was local control, with the C underlined, and that the whole movement was to put more control back in the local board's hands for how their school district was to be run. From everything from more curriculum matters to calendar, the way the school calendar was devised and developed based on what their own districts needed. And we have over time, and that's been, it doesn't, for those of us it doesn't seem that long ago, but it's been, over 20 years ago when that, so, but over time you sort of, I will agree that we've sort of inched our way away from local control in a lot of areas. In some, the calendar's a good example. I don't know that there's a single superintendent in the state of North Carolina that is not an advocate for local calendar control. Having the board, along with the educators in that district, develop a calendar that meets the needs of that district. That's not what we have, unfortunately. We have a calendar mandates that are dictated by the General Assembly. And the General Assembly is just that. They're the legislative body, so that's certainly within their right to do that.
Sure.
But what I fail to understand is how they, as a deliberative body, can understand all of the needs of every district in the state of North Carolina and have a single policy that meets those needs. And that's not what they do. So our districts in the Northeast, because of hurricanes, we don't really have to deal with winter weather the same way that the folks in the mountains do, but for hurricanes, we do. And we need more flexible control on our calendar. Every superintendent will tell you they need flexible control of their calendar.
Absolutely.
The way funding is spent is another issue. But we could have I'm sure we could have a 2-hour discussion if we just talk about just this one issue. But I guess I would like for folks both in the GA and at the Department of Public Instruction to remember that at its very core, the mission is for local boards of education in conjunction with their citizens and their educators to make the decisions that's best for the students in their district. And most of the time, that's how that should be done. Now, there are times when there needs to be some central rules put in place. Absolutely.
Sure.
But what's odd, Dr. Wright, is in some cases it really depends on the issue. Some cases they're very hands off, and you would think that in those cases, and I'll give you an example: masks.
Right.
So they have left whether mask mandates. They've left that to local boards to decide. Now we can argue whether that should be left to local boards or not. My own personal opinion is that should be something that's handled at the state level. But something like the calendar, which should be a local issue, is not a local issue. So it's sometimes confusing. So I will grant you that it's not always clear that local control rules the day anymore, unfortunately.
That's right.
We'll leave it at that.
All right. I like that answer. I appreciate that. So let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned a little bit about this already, but the pandemic itself has provided a ton of challenges to school leaders on a daily basis, just from one thing to another. Right now, I'm getting calls practically every day from practically every principal in my district about something related to COVID with students and or staff.
Right.
And that's my job, and not a problem. But going forward, what tips would you give to leaders right now who are having to navigate these pandemic challenges, either as veterans or even as new leaders? What tips would you give?
First of all, I would say that the senior leadership in the district, and that would be superintendent, associate superintendents, need to be there needs to they have to be on the same page with their local board of education.
Absolutely.
If that requires a retreat of some sort, they need to be on the same page. And it needs to be understood by all parties that the goal of this is to protect the health and safety of students and staff and the community at large. Because none of our staff and none of our students go home to an empty house. I mean, we go back to our communities. We have our own families. And so it's not just those students in the building or those staff members in the building that are impacted. They go and come from homes that have other people that can impact or be impacted by the decisions that are made. So you have to be on, if you're making policies in a district related to COVID, you have to be on the same page with the folks who are having to enact those policies. That's one thing. I think communication is important. Make sure your messaging is very clear to your parents and your students and your staff on what you're doing and why you're doing it when you make a decision. If districts have to put in a mandatory vaccination plan based on what the president said today, then that's going to require some major messaging to those employees. Same thing with students. Now, I don't imagine that we're going to have, we're not at the point where we're doing mandatory vaccinations of students, although the age groups for students that can be vaccinated is certainly going to change, and it's going to continue to widen so we can have more and more students vaccinated. But you need to make sure that you're messaging, and you need to be very clear about why you're doing it. And you need to understand that not everybody is going to understand it the first time. So you're going to have to be good listeners. And I think the other thing too is that districts need to provide feedback back to the state, back to the governor's office, back to the General Assembly, back to the Department of Public Instruction, and even back to the state health department and the health officials as to what's going on in their district and what the policies, how those are being received. It's not enough for folks in Raleigh to send us or send the district's information. I think they need an equal share of information from those regions so that they get a clear picture of what's going on around each region of the state, each district. So that you have that clear information going both ways. And that can be done through your local health department back to the state, or certainly through the superintendents back to the Department of Public Instruction and then to the governor's office. There's ways to do that. And I think that we do that and through the RISA with our meetings. Certainly we're fortunate that our state board representative attends our meetings pretty regularly. So I think we provide her a good picture of what's going on in our districts relative to our COVID strategies. What works, what's not working so good, where we're having issues. Also, when policies come from the state, where we're having difficulty deciphering exactly what's going on. And we talked about that off the air before the show, is that, we felt like we had received information earlier in the spring about a certain policy, and today we're not quite sure that that's exactly the way it is. So there's some clarification that's going to have to take place.
Right.
But, this is a scary time, and a lot of times I think you have folks that are struggling with masks. You have folks that are struggling with vaccinations. They don't trust them. A lot of people don't trust masks. A lot of people, and I think that part of that is that it's just such an uneasy time. Even though we've been living with COVID for months now, it's still very uneasy to people. I think in some cases it's very unbelievable to people that we can have a pandemic, a virus of this magnitude. And so I think you have to you just have to understand that everybody's at different places, and you have to continue to chip away at disinformation or misunderstanding um, in your own districts. Um, so that's sort of, I think just keeping communication open, trying to have a team approach, making sure your board and the superintendent and the top leadership folks are on the same page as to what the plans are, and how you're going to tackle this, and making sure that everyone up front knows that the reason you're doing what you're doing is for health and safety reasons. You're trying to keep
Exactly.
everybody safe.
And Dr. Mansfield, I think that's the thing that's probably missing in all of this when people get upset at the decisions that are being made. Um, we're making these decisions, and as educators, we've always been taught that the number one thing that we're supposed to do is to try to guarantee student safety as best we can.
Correct.
And then right behind that is education. So, when we ask for mask mandates because of the regions that we live in or what have you, it's not about trying to bridle folks, but it's more about trying to provide safety. As much safety as we can, because this pandemic is real. All you got to do is ask most people in our communities now, and if it hasn't affected them directly, they've got a neighbor or someone that's been impacted. So
that is exactly
that's absolutely right. Dr. Mansfield, is there anything else that you would like to share? We could talk all night for sure, as you said.
Sure. I would just say if you have listeners who are aspiring to the superintendency,
Right.
I would just tell them, first of all, it's not going to be like any job you've ever done in a school district. If you are an assistant superintendent, the superintendency is nothing like being an assistant superintendent. Just like being a principal is nothing like being an assistant principal. And that's just a given. There are so many moving parts to the superintendency beyond just the operational aspects of a district. Getting the books, buses, and used to be, you say butts, but that's not really what you say anymore. But getting the buses running on time, making sure every kid's got books and resources, those are operational things that can be worked out with strategies and things. Make sure you come into a superintendency completely wide-eyed to understand the politics of what your position is. And I don't mean that negatively. That's because politics is a tool.
Sure.
And that tool can either be your friend or your foe, and it will be both. There will be times when politics will beat you over the head, and there will be times when politics will get you what you want. It's gonna be, you're not gonna master it all the time. But I would say to any aspiring superintendent, just a few things. First of all, know who you are. Know yourself. Know what your values are. Know what is important to you, where you are in what situation you're willing to fall on your sword. And that's very few and far between, I will tell you. There are a few times when you really need to fall on your sword. The sun will rise again the next day, but there are times when you may need to. Number two, be true to that person, because there will be a lot of factors that will try to pull you away from who you are, for whatever reason. And there are good people that go into the superintendency, and in some cases, most cases they do a phenomenal job, but there are some cases where they're pulled away from who they truly are.
Mm-hmm.
And don't let that happen. Be the person you are, regardless of the day of the week, the month of the year, because that's part of why you were hired to do what you're doing, because of who you are. And so don't abandon that value set because you're superintendent. And the other thing is, keep in mind that you lead a group of people. That is, you lead students, you lead teachers and other employees, and you lead a community. And people trump everything else. You got to get the people right first. You can make a mistake with technology. You can, you can do a lot of things. Your buses may be late once in a while. You can do something. Some things can go awry, but make sure you take care of your people, because number one, particularly in today's times, you cannot go out there and find educators. It is hard to find folks. So the folks that you have that are good educators, whether they're in the cafeteria, and I say educator, I mean anybody that's in the system. If you're in the cafeteria, you're an educator. If you drive a bus, you're an educator. If you do maintenance or you are a receptionist, you're an educator. Those children look to you for leadership in that community and those schools. So take care of the people that make your district go. They can do without you, but it's just like when your electricity goes, nobody calls the superintendent when your air conditioning goes out.
That's right.
They don't care about you. They need their air conditioning working. So there are people that make your district run smoothly. And just remember, you're their leader and you need to take care of those people as best you can. You need to fight for them when they deserve fighting for, which is most all the time. There are a lot of things that you can do as a superintendent that are great, but I would say that's the one thing. Human capital is the most important.
Outstanding, and that's good stuff. You mentioned employees, and that no matter what their role is, they're still educators. In Hertford County, we use the term direct instruction and indirect instruction employees. So, if that climate control is not right in that classroom, learning is not going to take place. So,
right. It sounds cliche, but
that's right.
But that those first words out of that bus driver's mouth in the morning, "Good morning, how are you? Glad you're on my bus today." That sets the tone.
They're so critical. That's exactly right. Dr. Mansfield, if you'll hold on with me for just a minute, we'll come back and close out the show.
All right.
My guest next week will be Dr. Stephen Peters. Dr. Peters is a nationally known author, a former superintendent, and he currently leads an organization aimed at modeling and molding educational leaders. He and his wife have also mentored many, many students across the United States over the years in public school settings. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to have him on my podcast. That podcast will be next Thursday, September 16th, 2021 at 7 p.m. And also coming up, I've got a surprise for you that we'll kind of sneak in occasionally. We'll do some excerpts from a ribbon cutting ceremony that I've got coming forth soon for the new Hosky Elementary School. I'm going to take the opportunity to have a little shameless plug, but also celebrate the successes that we're having here in the Hertford County Public School District. So look forward to that coming real soon to the Wright Experience podcast. Dr. Mansfield, I just want to say thank you very much for being a part of the Wright Experience. And
thank you. Congratulations on the show. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Dr. Mansfield, I remember almost 6 years ago when I came to the district. I think you were just getting to Martin around the same time that I was coming here. And I've always valued our friendship and our working relationship. And certainly, I think a lot of your leadership, and I'm thankful for your leadership, and look forward to continuing to work with you for the time that we have together, and you as executive director now, and me trying to serve these 2,500 students and 500 employees in Hertford County. So thank you.
I appreciate it. I feel the same way. I thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And to the Wright Experience Audit, thank you for watching. Good evening.